A cop pulls over a black teen and his father on a quiet suburban street, until the officer starts making crude, racist remarks about the teen. With a smug grin, he insults the boy loudly, thinking he's being clever, thinking he's untouchable. He doesn't realize what he's about to face, but within minutes, everything changes. The father steps forward, and suddenly, the cop's face drains of color. His hands tremble. What happens next? It shakes the officer to his core. What the officer said will disgust you, but what follows? It's even worse for him. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe how this one ends. The sun was setting on the small town as Jordan, a 16-year-old black teenager, sat quietly in the passenger seat of his father's car. They were just coming back from a long day at the park, enjoying some rare time together. His father, Chief Daniels, was a strong, respected man, one who had worked his way up in life, overcoming obstacles to build a better future for his son. But Jordan, like any teen, wasn't looking for confrontation. He was just focused on getting home. As they drove through their neighborhood, the calm was suddenly interrupted. Blue and red lights flashed in their rearview mirror. "Not again," Jordan muttered under his breath, already knowing what was coming. He had been stopped by officers a few times before, for the most ridiculous reasons, but this time, something felt different. The car pulled over to the side of the road, and the officer's cruiser parked behind them. Officer Bradley Larson, a white police officer with a reputation for his aggressive attitude, stepped out of his vehicle. With a badge gleaming on his chest and a look of superiority, Larson sauntered toward the car. Jordan's father remained calm, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped by Larson, but this time Jordan was in the car with him, and that changed everything. "License and registration," Larson snapped as he reached the window. His tone was sharp, not even a hint of courtesy in his voice. Jordan's father, always composed, handed over the documents without a word. He wasn't intimidated by Larson. He had dealt with far worse. But something about the officer's energy today made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Larson glanced at the documents, then looked back at Jordan, his eyes scanning him up and down. There was an uncomfortable silence before Larson finally spoke, his words dripping with disdain. "Something doesn't feel right here," Larson muttered, more to himself than to them. Jordan glanced over at his dad, who remained silent, but Jordan could feel the tension building. His father's calm demeanor made him feel safe, but Larson's actions made him uneasy. He had seen this kind of bias before, unwarranted, unprovoked, and unjust. And then the officer took it too far. "Get out of the car," Larson ordered. Jordan looked at his father, who nodded ever so slightly. Jordan hesitated, but he knew he had to follow the officer's instructions. Still, his heart was racing. This was it. He had no idea that this simple traffic stop would spiral out of control. As Larson stood there, his eyes shifting between the documents in his hand and Jordan's face, a chill spread through the air. Jordan's mind raced. He didn't know what was coming next. But something in the officer's eyes told him this wasn't just another traffic stop. Larson was acting differently today, his gaze sharper, his posture rigid. Something wasn't right. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jordan's father asked calmly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, steady, but it carried an unmistakable authority. It was the voice of someone who had been through the fire and wasn't about to back down now. Larson's eyes flicked back to Chief Daniels for a brief moment. Then he sneered. "You know, you're not supposed to be out here after dark. Seems a little suspicious to me." His voice had an edge now. "And your son here," Larson continued, looking at Jordan with contempt, "looks like he's up to no good." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. His father stayed silent, his face unreadable. He knew all too well what Larson was implying. "I'm just taking my son home, officer. We don't need to be harassed," Chief Daniels said, his calmness almost unnerving. Larson took a step closer to the car, his breath now coming a little faster. "I'm not harassing anyone, but I've got to do my job," he said, the words practically dripping with mockery. "You should have just stayed at home, not stirring up trouble." Jordan's fists clenched involuntarily. He had heard enough, but the last thing he wanted to do was make the situation worse. "Why don't you let us go, officer? We haven't done anything wrong." Jordan's voice was firm but controlled. Larson ignored him. His hands began to twitch, as if he was looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. "Step out of the car, boy," Larson barked, this time with a vicious edge to his voice. Jordan's heart raced as he locked eyes with his father. But instead of panicking, Chief Daniels gave him a subtle nod, signaling him to stay calm. Jordan, nervous but composed, opened the door and stepped out slowly, trying to keep his movements deliberate. He didn't want to provoke the officer, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. As Jordan stood facing Larson, the officer took a long, hard look at him. His eyes narrowed as he sized him up, clearly judging him based on nothing more than the color of his skin. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," Larson muttered under his breath. Just as the tension reached its peak, Chief Daniels opened his door and stepped out, his calm presence cutting through the air like a blade. His voice rang out, strong and measured. "That's enough, Larson. You need to step back." Larson hesitated. There was something in the chief's voice, something undeniable. For a moment, Larson froze, caught in a moment of uncertainty. But the cop wasn't done. His pride wouldn't let him back down, not so easily. "And what? You gonna tell me how to do my job now? You think you can intimidate me with that badge?" Chief Daniels took a step closer, but his tone remained firm. "You need to stop, Larson, now." Larson's lips curled into a sneer, his confidence quickly returning. "You think you're tough?" Larson scoffed. "You really want me to back down because you think your badge means something to me?" Before Chief Daniels could respond, Larson swung his fist at Jordan, hitting him in the stomach with a violent force. Jordan gasped, pain shooting through his body as he staggered back. The entire park fell silent. The sight of his son being struck hit Chief Daniels like a bolt of lightning. "You're done, Larson," the chief growled, his voice now a deadly whisper. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Jordan winced from the punch, but he stayed on his feet. He looked at his father, who was already moving with purpose toward the officer. In the chaos, no one noticed the small group of onlookers who had gathered, their phones out, recording the incident. The word was already spreading. The cop had just crossed a line, and now the entire town was going to see it. The air around them was thick with tension. Jordan stood frozen for a moment, his hand clutching his stomach where the punch landed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But what hit harder wasn't the pain. It was the disbelief. He had never thought he'd be treated like this by someone who was supposed to protect him. And to make it worse, it was happening in front of his father, the one person who had always taught him to be strong in the face of adversity. Chief Daniels, standing tall beside him, didn't even flinch at the violence. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and his presence seemed to fill the air. He stepped forward, blocking Larson from any further aggression toward his son. Larson's eyes darted from Jordan to Chief Daniels, and for a brief moment there was confusion. "What do you think you're doing?" Larson sneered, his hands clenched in fists. "You think you're going to make me stop?" The chief didn't flinch. "You made a mistake today, Larson," he said, his voice low and calm but filled with authority. "You picked the wrong person to mess with." Larson scoffed. "You think that badge means anything to me? You're just another officer. No one's going to care." But Chief Daniels remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not just another officer. I'm the chief of police in this town," he said, letting the weight of the words sink in. For a moment, Larson looked like he'd been struck harder than he'd ever hit anyone before. His smug grin faded, his eyes widening in shock. The realization hit Larson like a ton of bricks. He looked back at the father and son, his breath suddenly heavier. He had just punched the son of the very man who was now in charge of the department. "You're the new chief." Larson's voice faltered. "But why didn't you say something sooner?" Chief Daniels stood taller now, the gravity of his words and actions clearly sinking in. "I wasn't going to let you know who I am until you showed your true colors," he said, his voice still calm but colder than ice. "And you did exactly that. You abused your power." Larson, now realizing how deeply he had messed up, looked around the park. The bystanders had gathered, many of them recording the incident on their phones. A few people were whispering, others were muttering about what they had just witnessed. The officer's anger shifted into panic. He was trapped. Jordan stood behind his father, his stomach still aching from the punch, but now filled with something else. Relief. His father wasn't just the person who protected him at home. He was now standing up for him in front of everyone. Larson's expression morphed from anger to fear. "You can't do this," he said, his voice now shaking with a mix of anger and panic. "You can't just come in here and take over. I'm an officer. I'm above you." "Not anymore," the chief said, stepping forward and pulling out his phone. "I'm calling this in. You'll be reported, and you'll face the consequences of your actions. This isn't just a mistake, Larson. This is a crime." Larson's eyes darted around as he searched for an excuse, a way out of the situation. But it was too late. Chief Daniels had already made the call. "You'll never wear that badge again," the chief said, his words sending a chill through the air. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder as backup arrived. More officers pulled into the parking lot, taking in the scene. The crowd was growing, and with it, the intensity of the moment. "You're done," Chief Daniels repeated, standing in front of Larson. "This isn't just about you. This is about accountability. You can't hide behind that badge and treat people like this. Not anymore." The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Larson stood there, his body trembling, as he realized there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was going to pay the price. Bystanders began to speak up, some of them voicing their support for the chief's actions, others expressing shock at the officer's behavior. The truth was out. Larson had crossed the line, and now the town was going to make sure he faced the consequences. As the sirens grew louder and the tension in the air thickened, Larson's panic continued to escalate. He stood frozen, as though every move he made would seal his fate. His eyes darted from the growing crowd to the chief, then to his own trembling hands. The weight of the situation crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. He had crossed a line he never should have approached, and now the consequences were looming larger than ever. But just when Larson thought he might be able to talk his way out of it, a twist came that no one, not even Chief Daniels, saw coming. A tall officer arrived on the scene, his uniform crisp, his demeanor professional, but serious. He walked straight up to Larson, who was still standing in stunned silence. The officer's eyes quickly scanned the situation, taking in the father and son duo, the crowd of witnesses, and the unmistakable tension in the air. Then, without missing a beat, the officer turned to Larson and said, "Officer Larson, I'm placing you under arrest for misconduct and excessive force. You're coming with me." Larson's eyes widened. "What?" he exclaimed, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You can't do this. I was just doing my job." The officer shook his head. "You've been reported. We've already reviewed the footage. You'll be facing charges." The world seemed to slow down around Larson as he processed what was happening. For the first time, he understood that there was no way out. The power he thought he had, the sense of invincibility he held in his badge, was now nothing more than a flimsy piece of metal. His future, his career, everything was slipping away. But the biggest shock came when Larson turned back to face Chief Daniels. The realization finally hit. Chief Daniels wasn't just some bystander. He was the man who had the authority to make sure Larson's actions didn't go unpunished. Chief Daniels, standing tall and calm, spoke softly, but with an undeniable edge. "You're done, Larson. You'll never wear that badge again. You've proven exactly what I've been trying to change." Larson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat tightened as his mind raced, struggling to come to terms with the magnitude of what had just happened. He had taken a swing at the wrong kid, at the wrong family, and now he was about to pay the price. But what stunned Larson even more was the silence from the crowd. They weren't just passive bystanders, they were witnesses. They had seen everything. The shock of what had happened was palpable, and the crowd wasn't afraid to make their voices heard. Whispers turned into murmurs of agreement, and a few brave souls stepped forward to support the chief's decision. "This is what needs to happen," one man said, his voice steady, but filled with anger. No one should be above the law, not even him. The other officers who had arrived on the scene simply stood by, silent, letting the situation unfold. They weren't stepping in. They weren't defending Larson. They were standing behind Chief Daniels, knowing full well that what he was doing was right. They knew what Larson had done was wrong, and they knew better than to get in the way of justice. "It's over," Chief Daniels said again, his voice colder than before. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry, he was simply stating the truth. Larson was done. But as Larson was cuffed and escorted to the police car, Chief Daniels took a deep breath, looking over at his son. Jordan was standing there, still shaken by the entire ordeal but now filled with a sense of pride. His father had done what no one else would have had the courage to do. He had made sure the officer responsible for the violence didn't get away with it. Jordan stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful. "Dad, you didn't just change things for me. You changed things for everyone." Chief Daniels smiled faintly, though the gravity of the situation was still heavy on his shoulders. "We don't do this for praise, son. We do this because it's the right thing to do. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." As Larson was driven away, Chief Daniels and his son stood side by side. The world around them was shifting. There was a new sense of hope in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The fight for justice wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty. But standing up for what was right could make a difference. It already had. The days that followed Larson's arrest were filled with a mix of emotions. Chief Daniels had done what he promised. He ensured justice would be served not just for his son, but for the entire community. The officer's actions were now under intense scrutiny. The incident had shaken the town, but it had also sparked a much-needed conversation about abuse of power and accountability. The following morning, news outlets were already covering the story. People were divided. Some questioned whether the chief had overreacted, but most agreed that what Larson had done was indefensible. The video of the officer punching Jordan had gone viral, and the overwhelming public reaction was one of support for Chief Daniels. Many praised him for handling the situation with composure and strength, while others were relieved that someone had finally stood up to the abuse of authority they had witnessed for far too long. "I've seen things like this before," one of the witnesses at the park said in an interview. "But I've never seen anyone stand up like the chief did. It made me believe again that we can make a difference." For Jordan, the whole ordeal was a blur. He was still processing everything: the punch, his father's calm strength in the face of such a blatant injustice, and the aftermath. It wasn't easy for him to wrap his head around the idea that his father had been quietly serving as the new chief of police. But it had all made sense when his dad explained that he hadn't wanted to use his position to solve every problem. Justice, he said, wasn't about power. It was about making the right decision, no matter who you were. As the investigation into Larson's conduct proceeded, the weight of the moment started to sink in for both father and son. Jordan understood now more than ever what it meant to stand up for yourself and for others. But more importantly, he saw how crucial it was to hold those in power accountable. His father hadn't just spoken about the values of justice, he had lived them. A few weeks later, Chief Daniels found himself sitting in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened. The public outcry had led to real change. The police department was undergoing an internal review, and reforms were being discussed. The town, once divided on the issue of police accountability, was now coming together to demand a fairer, more transparent system. But even with all the progress being made, the situation still weighed heavily on Chief Daniels' mind. It wasn't about the arrest or the media coverage. It was about the fear that had driven people to remain silent for so long. Fear of speaking out. Fear of being labeled an outsider. Fear of the system itself. As Chief Daniels sat in his office, Jordan walked in, a rare moment of silence between father and son. "Dad, I was thinking," Jordan began, "do you think things will ever really change? Or is this just the beginning?" Chief Daniels smiled faintly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, son. But every time someone speaks up, every time someone stands up for what's right, it adds up." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet hope in his words that wasn't there before. "And it's up to people like you and me to make sure it continues," he added, glancing at Jordan. "It's not just about fixing what's broken now. It's about creating a future where everyone has a fair shot, where nobody feels scared to speak their truth." Jordan nodded, his thoughts swirling. He knew his father's words were true, but he also knew that this fight for justice wasn't over. It had just begun, and with his father leading the charge, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just the son of the chief. He was part of something bigger now. He was part of a movement. As the days passed, Chief Daniels continued his work quietly and diligently. The officers under his command were being held to higher standards. The people of the town were speaking out, demanding change, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like real progress was possible. But the real victory, Chief Daniels knew, was in how the incident had changed the way people saw themselves and their community. It wasn't just about Larson's punishment. It was about creating a culture where people understood that they could stand up for what was right, no matter who they were. Jordan, too, had changed. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He had seen the power of standing up to authority, the power of using your voice, even when it feels like no one is listening. And now, he was committed to making sure that everyone around him understood that they had the right to demand better. That standing up for justice wasn't just a one-time event, it was a lifelong commitment. The lesson was clear. When you have the power to make a change, don't wait for someone else to do it for you. Stand up. Speak out. Make your voice heard, because you never know when the opportunity will arise to make a difference. As Jordan and his father walked out of the police station that afternoon, side by side, they both understood that this moment was far from over. The fight for justice wasn't just about one incident. It was about building a future where everyone had an equal chance to thrive. And that, Chief Daniels knew, was worth fighting for. The town had changed in more ways than one. What started as a shocking moment of violence turned into a catalyst for a larger transformation. Chief Daniels' actions weren't just about putting one bad officer behind bars. They were about setting an example for everyone in the community. Standing up for what's right, no matter the consequences, was a lesson the town would never forget. People began to take notice. The police force was changing, with accountability and integrity becoming the cornerstones of its future. And it wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about the entire community recognizing that they had a part to play in ensuring justice, equality, and respect for all. Jordan had learned so much from his father. He had learned that real strength wasn't in physical power. It was in knowing when to stand firm and when to show compassion. He had witnessed firsthand how his father fought for what was right, no matter how hard it was. And now, Jordan was determined to keep fighting for justice, just like his father. "The world isn't always fair," Chief Daniels said, looking at his son with pride. "But we have the power to make it better, one step at a time." And that was the message that carried with them as they walked away from the scene. Change wasn't immediate. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without sacrifice. But it was possible, and they had already taken the first step. Now it's your turn. What would you have done if you were in Chief Daniels' shoes? Would you have had the courage to stand up when it mattered most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can keep the conversation going about justice, accountability, and standing up for what's right.